Four brothers walked onto a Little League field in Millbrook, Connecticut on June 14, 1986, and never walked off. The Castellano boys, Marco, 12, Tony, 10, Danny, 8, and little Sal, just 6, vanished during the 7th inning of what should have been an ordinary Saturday game. No witnesses, no screams, no trace. The case baffled investigators for decades until last month, when a storage unit belonging to their former coach was finally opened, revealing a truth more horrifying than anyone imagined. If you're into cinematic true crime stories based on real-life disappearances and cold cases finally cracked, subscribe now and tap the bell icon. Detective Sarah Chun had seen the Castellano file more times than she cared to count. 43 pages of witness statements, evidence logs, and dead ends, all bound together with a rubber band that had long since lost its snap. The case had been passed down through 3 generations of Millbrook PD detectives like a cursed heirloom, unsolvable, unforgettable, and undeniably haunting. Now, at 2:47 on a gray October afternoon in 2024, Sarah sat in her unmarked sedan outside Secure Storage Solutions on Route 7, staring at Unit 47B. The orange roll-up door was sealed with evidence tape, but she could see the gap underneath where decades of secrets had been waiting in the dark. The call had come in 3 days earlier. Frank Morrison, 73, had died of a heart attack in his Waterbury apartment. No family, no will, just a storage unit he'd been paying for religiously since 1987. When the facility manager opened it after the required legal waiting period, he'd found something that made him immediately call the police. Sarah had been the responding detective. She'd been working cold cases for 8 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw when that door rolled up. Baseball equipment, team photos, and a metal filing cabinet that would change everything the town of Millbrook thought they knew about that June day in 1986. Frank Morrison had been the Millbrook Lions assistant coach, a quiet man in his 30s who helped with equipment and kept detailed statistics. After the boys disappeared, he'd been questioned extensively but cleared of any involvement. He had an alibi. He'd been in the dugout with 12 other players when the Castellano brothers simply vanished from the field. Sarah pulled on latex gloves and ducked under the crime scene tape. The storage unit was exactly as they'd left it after the initial discovery. Baseball bats leaned against one wall, their Louisville Slugger logos faded with age. Boxes of cleats sat stacked in corners, sizes ranging from Youth 1 to Adult 12. Team photos from 1984, 1985, and 1986 were thumbtacked to a cork board, the faces of dozens of young players smiling back at her with the innocent hope that only comes with childhood. But it was the filing cabinet that drew her attention. 3 drawers, each labeled with masking tape in Morrison's careful handwriting. The top drawer read, Team Records 1984 to 1986. The middle drawer was marked Equipment Inventory. But it was the bottom drawer that had stopped her cold during her first visit, Special Projects. Sarah opened the top drawer first, methodically photographing each document before removing it. Game schedules, batting averages, parent contact information, all the mundane paperwork of youth sports. But as she dug deeper, she found something that made her pause. A manila folder labeled Castellano Boys, Individual Assessments. Inside were detailed notes on each brother, written in Morrison's precise hand. Marco was described as natural leader, good with younger players, protective of brothers. Tony was quiet, observant, follows Marco's lead without question. Danny was noted as energetic, sometimes disruptive, needs constant supervision. And little Sal was simply described as trusting, eager to please, easily influenced. The assessments were dated 2 weeks before the disappearance. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Detective Mike Reeves, her partner. Crime scene photos from '86 are digitized. Sending them over now. She opened her laptop and pulled up the files. The baseball field looked exactly as she remembered from her own childhood. Chain-link backstop, aluminum bleachers, a concession stand that sold overpriced hot dogs and warm soda. But seeing it through the lens of an active crime scene made everything different. Yellow evidence markers dotted the field where the boys were last seen. Crime scene photographers had captured every angle, every detail, every heartbreaking piece of abandoned equipment. In one photo, she could see the Castellano family car still parked behind the third base bleachers. A 1984 Oldsmobile station wagon with wood grain panels and a "My Child is an Honor Student" bumper sticker. The trunk was open, revealing lawn chairs and a cooler packed with orange slices and Capri Sun pouches, snacks that would never be consumed. Another photo showed the dugout where Morrison claimed to have been during the disappearance. The team roster was taped to the wall, and Sarah could clearly see all 4 Castellano names written in blue ink. Marco was batting fourth, Tony seventh. Danny was listed as a substitute, and Sal wasn't on the roster at all. He was just there to watch his brothers play. Sarah returned to the filing cabinet and opened the middle drawer. Equipment inventory sheets dating back to 1984, each item meticulously cataloged. Bats, balls, gloves, helmets, uniforms, everything a Little League team needed. But as she flipped through the pages, she noticed something odd. Several items were marked as on loan with no return date. For baseball gloves, for helmets, for sets of cleats. All in the sizes that would have fit the Castellano brothers. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the bottom drawer. Special projects contained only 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a manila envelope sealed with tape, and a small wooden box with a brass clasp. Sarah opened the journal first. The entries began in January 1986, just 5 months before the disappearance. Morrison's handwriting was different here, looser, more frantic, as if he were writing quickly or under stress. January 15th, 1986. The facility is ready. Dr. Whitmore says the first phase can begin as soon as we identify suitable candidates. The criteria are specific: male, ages 6 to 12, close family bonds, minimal extended family involvement. The Castellano boys fit perfectly. Sarah's blood ran cold. She flipped ahead, her eyes scanning for more details. March 3rd, 1986. Observed the boys during practice today. Marco shows natural leadership qualities. Tony is loyal but independent. Danny is energetic but manageable. Sal is still very young, but Dr. Whitmore insists that younger subjects adapt more easily to the program. Beginning individual assessments next week. April 20th, 1986. Parents are becoming suspicious. Mrs. Castellano asked why I've been paying special attention to her boys. Told her they show exceptional potential, and I'm considering recommending them for a summer baseball camp. She seemed pleased. The deception is necessary. May 30th, 1986. Final preparations complete. The van is equipped and positioned. Dr. Whitmore has prepared the reception area. Timeline must be precise. 7th inning provides optimal distraction when parents are focused on the game. Boys will be told they're being taken for a special training session. By the time anyone realizes they're missing, we'll be hours away. Sarah set the journal down, her hands trembling. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a carefully planned operation that had been in the works for months. But who was Dr. Whitmore? And what was this facility Morrison kept mentioning? She picked up the sealed manila envelope. Inside were photographs, and what she saw made her stomach turn. For boys in what appeared to be a concrete room, sitting on metal beds. They were wearing matching gray uniforms instead of their baseball clothes. The photos were dated June 15, 1986, one day after the disappearance. The boys looked confused but not terrified. Sal was crying, but Tony had his arm around him in a protective gesture. Marco stood slightly apart from his brothers, his jaw set in the defiant expression she recognized from the team photos. Danny was looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to ask, "When do we get to go home?" But it was the background of the photos that made Sarah's hands shake. The walls were lined with what appeared to be observation windows, one-way glass that suggested the boys were being watched. Numbers were stenciled on the wall. Subject: Housing Unit A. The final item in the drawer was the wooden box. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing a collection of small personal items: a Mickey Mouse watch, a baseball card, 1985 Topps Don Mattingly, a Superman keychain, and a small wooden cross on a chain. Each item was labeled with masking tape. Marco, Tony, Danny, Sal. These were their personal belongings, the little treasures that kids carry in their pockets. The things that would have been taken from them when they arrived at whatever facility Morrison and Dr. Whitmore had prepared. Sarah's phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. The caller ID showed Captain Rodriguez. "Chun, where are we on the Morrison storage unit?" "Captain, you need to get down here. This isn't just evidence of a kidnapping. I think we're looking at something much bigger." "What do you mean?" Sarah looked around the storage unit, taking in the baseball equipment, the team photos, the carefully maintained records. I think Morrison was running some kind of selection process. The Little League team was just cover. He was identifying targets and delivering them to someone else. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'm sending backup. Don't touch anything else until the FBI gets there. FBI. Sarah, if what you're suggesting is true, if there was an organized operation targeting children, this goes way beyond our jurisdiction. I'm making the call. After hanging up, Sarah stood alone in the storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of Frank Morrison's double life. On the walls, dozens of young faces smiled back at her from team photos spanning 3 years. How many of these children had been assessed? How many had been considered as potential targets? She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the 1986 team photo. The Castellano brothers were in the front row, just as she remembered. But now she noticed something she'd missed before. Morrison wasn't in the photo. In fact, looking through all the team pictures, she couldn't find a single image of the assistant coach. He'd been there, documenting everything, but he'd stayed behind the camera. Always watching, never seen. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from Detective Reeves. Found something in the original case files. Morrison gave an interview 3 days after the disappearance. Said he left the game early due to a family emergency. But according to the witness statements, his car was in the parking lot until after 7 p.m. She typed back, "What family emergency?" Said his mother had a heart attack. But get this, his mother died in 1983. Sarah closed the journal and carefully placed all the evidence back in the filing cabinet. The FBI would need to see everything exactly as she'd found it. But as she waited for backup to arrive, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storage unit was just the beginning. Morrison had kept meticulous records of his special project, but the journal entries ended abruptly on June 14, 1986, the day of the disappearance. What had happened to the boys after that? Where was this facility? And most importantly, was Dr. Whitmore still out there? As she stood in the growing darkness of the storage unit, surrounded by the ghosts of Morrison's victims, Sarah realized she wasn't just investigating a cold case anymore. She was following a trail that had been deliberately obscured for 38 years, and she had no idea where it would lead. But she was certain of one thing. The Castellano brothers had been taken by people who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was part of something larger, more systematic, and far more terrifying than anyone in Millbrook had ever imagined. The orange door of Unit 47B cast long shadows across the pavement as Sarah waited for the FBI to arrive. Somewhere out there, the truth about what happened to Marco, Tony, Danny, and little Sal was waiting to be uncovered. And Sarah Chun was going to find it, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. The FBI arrived at 6:43 p.m. in 3 black SUVs that made the Secure Storage Solutions parking lot look like a crime scene from a movie. Special Agent Rebecca Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression all business. She was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe early 40s, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she'd seen more than her share of humanity's darkest corners. "Detective Chin? I'm Agent Torres, Behavioral Analysis Unit. I understand you've uncovered evidence suggesting an organized child abduction operation." Sarah led her through the storage unit, explaining each discovery. Torres examined Morrison's journal with the methodical precision of someone who'd built a career on understanding predators. She photographed every page, every notation, every seemingly insignificant detail. "This level of documentation is unusual," Torres said, closing the journal. "Most offenders try to minimize evidence." Morrison was either incredibly arrogant or he was keeping records for someone else. "Someone like Dr. Whitmore?" Torres nodded grimly. "We need to find out who that is. But first, I want to understand the timeline better. The disappearance happened during the 7th inning." Sarah pulled out her copy of the original case file. According to witness statements, the boys were sitting in the bleachers behind first base around 4:30 p.m. The next time anyone looked for them was the top of the 8th inning, when their mother, Angela Castellano, went to tell them they were leaving after the game. That's roughly a 20-minute window, maybe less. The 7th inning stretch would have been the perfect distraction. Everyone's attention on the field, parents chatting, kids running around. Torres examined the photos of the boys in the concrete room. These were taken the day after the disappearance, which means they were transported somewhere within hours of being taken. Morrison's journal mentions a van. Do we have any reports of suspicious vehicles in the area? Sarah shook her head. The original investigation was thorough, but they were looking for signs of a struggle or an accident. No one was thinking organized abduction with a predetermined escape route. Agent Torres's phone rang. She answered with a curt, "Torres," then listened for several minutes, occasionally jotting notes. When she hung up, her expression was even more serious. "That was our research team. Dr. Whitmore isn't a common name, and we found something interesting." Dr. Marcus Whitmore was a psychiatrist who lost his license in New York in 1984 for conducting unauthorized experiments on children in state care. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of experiments? Behavioral modification, isolation studies, psychological conditioning. The state shut him down, but he disappeared before criminal charges could be filed. His research focused on something he called social restructuring, essentially breaking down family bonds and rebuilding personality from the ground up. Jesus. And Morrison was delivering subjects to him. It looks that way. But here's what's really disturbing. Whitmore's research papers, before he lost his license, detailed the optimal age ranges and family dynamics for his studies. Male children, ages 6 to 12, with strong sibling bonds that could be systematically dismantled. Sarah stared at the team photo of the Castellano brothers. They weren't random victims. They were specifically chosen. We need to find Whitmore's facility. Morrison's journal mentions it repeatedly, but never gives a location. Sarah had been thinking about that. The photos show the boys one day after the disappearance. If they were taken during the game, transported that evening, and photographed the next morning, the facility couldn't be more than a few hours' drive from Millbrook. Torres nodded. We're already running searches for properties purchased or leased by Whitmore or Morrison between 1985 and 1987. But that's going to take time, and frankly, I'm not optimistic about finding records under their real names. What about the van Morrison mentioned? That might be traceable. We're working on that too. But Detective Chun, I want you to understand something. Even if we find this facility, the chances of the boys still being alive after 38 years. She didn't finish the sentence. Sarah understood. She'd been trying not to think about it, but the math was brutal. If the boys had survived whatever Whitmore had planned for them, Marco would be 50 now, Tony 48, Danny 46, and Sal 44. But survival seemed like the least likely outcome. There's something else, Torres continued. My team ran Morrison's name through our databases. He wasn't just a Little League coach. He worked part-time at 3 different youth organizations between 1983 and 1987, Little League, Boy Scouts, and a summer day camp in Hartford. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. You think there were other victims? I think the Castellano brothers might have been just one incident in a much larger operation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Reeves. Found something at Morrison's apartment. You need to get over here. 20 minutes later, Sarah and Agent Torres stood in the cramped living room of Frank Morrison's Waterbury apartment. The place smelled like old coffee and loneliness, the home of a man who'd lived his final years in isolation. But Detective Reeves had found something that changed everything. It was hidden behind a false back in his bedroom closet, Reeves explained, holding up a metal lockbox. Took me 3 hours to find it. Inside the box were more photographs, but these were different from the ones in the storage unit. They showed the same concrete facility, but the images had been taken over what appeared to be several years. The boys aged in the photos, from children to teenagers to young men. Sarah's hands shook as she looked through them. In early photos, the brothers were still together, still recognizable. But as the images progressed, something fundamental changed. Their expressions became blank, their postures rigid. They wore matching gray uniforms and had identical haircuts. Most disturbing of all, they no longer stood together as a family unit. Look at this one, Torres said, pointing to a photo dated 1992. The 4 boys, now young men, stood in a line, staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. They showed no recognition of each other, no familial connection. Whitmore's behavioral modification program, Sarah whispered. He actually did it. He broke their family bonds. But it was the final photo in the sequence that made Sarah's blood run cold. Dated 1995, it showed only 3 figures in gray uniforms. Sal, the youngest, was gone. Where's the fourth brother? Torres asked the question Sarah was afraid to voice. At the bottom of the lockbox, they found Morrison's final journal, a thin notebook with entries spanning from 1987 to 2003. The handwriting was different here, shakier, and the tone had changed from clinical documentation to something that sounded almost like guilt. March 15, 1992, visited the facility today. The subjects show complete integration into the program. Dr. Whitmore is pleased with the results, but I'm beginning to have concerns. The youngest subject, S, shows signs of psychological deterioration. Dr. Whitmore insists this is part of the process. August 3, 1994, subject S removed from program due to incompatibility. Dr. Whitmore won't explain what that means. The remaining 3 subjects continue to progress according to plan. January 22, 1995, Dr. Whitmore says the experiment is concluding. The subjects are ready for final placement. I'm no longer comfortable with my involvement, but he reminds me that I'm as culpable as he is. There's no walking away from this. June 1, 2003, Dr. Whitmore died today. Heart attack at his home in Vermont. I should feel relieved, but I keep thinking about those boys. What happened to them after 1995? Where did they go? I've been carrying this guilt for 17 years, and now I'll never know if they're alive or dead. The journal ended there, but tucked into the back cover was a business card, Mountain View Behavioral Health, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Director. The address was in Brattleboro, Vermont, about 2 hours north of Millbrook. That's our facility, Torres said, or at least where it was. Sarah was already on her phone, calling Captain Rodriguez. We need a road trip to Vermont, and we need a full forensic team. But Torres was studying the final photos again, her expression troubled. Detective Chun, look at this. She pointed to the background of the 1995 photo. Through what appeared to be a window, there was a glimpse of the outside world, trees, a parking lot, and what looked like other buildings. This wasn't an isolated compound, Torres continued. It was part of something larger. Look at the architecture in the background. Those buildings look institutional. Hospital, maybe, or a large residential facility. Sarah squinted at the photo. Torres was right. In the background, she could make out what appeared to be a multi-story brick building with small, uniformly spaced windows. Mountain View Behavioral Health, Torres said grimly. I'm betting it was more than just Whitmore's private practice. By 10 p.m., they were on the road to Vermont. Sarah drove while Torres worked her phone, coordinating with the Bureau's field office in Burlington. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows as they wound through the Connecticut hills toward the Vermont border. I keep thinking about that last journal entry, Sarah said. Morrison seemed genuinely troubled by what happened to the youngest boy. Sal, Torres replied. According to the photos, he was only 6 when they took him. The trauma of separation from his family at that age, combined with whatever Whitmore was doing to them. It's possible he had a complete psychological breakdown. And the others? If they survived the program, where would they be now? Torres was quiet for a long moment. That's what scares me, Detective. If Whitmore's behavioral modification program actually worked, if he succeeded in breaking their family bonds and rebuilding their personalities, those 3 men could be anywhere, living under assumed identities, with no memory of who they used to be. They passed a sign, "Welcome to Vermont, Green Mountain State." The road ahead was dark and winding, leading them toward answers that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face. There's something else in Morrison's final journal that bothers me, Torres continued. He mentions final placement for the subjects. That suggests Whitmore had somewhere specific to send them after the program was complete. Like what? Could be anything. Group homes, foster families, institutional care facilities. But if Whitmore was as systematic as his records suggest, he would have had a plan for what happened after he finished with them. Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. So somewhere out there, 3 men who used to be the Castellano brothers are living lives they don't remember, with names they were given by someone else. It's possible. Or, Torres didn't finish the thought. Or they're dead, Sarah said flatly. Behavioral modification programs like Whitmore's had a high failure rate. Not everyone could be successfully reprogrammed. Those who couldn't adapt were usually considered liabilities. They drove in silence for several miles, both lost in the implications of what they'd discovered. The Castellano boys hadn't just been kidnapped. They'd been systematically erased and replaced with new identities. Even if they were still alive, the children who'd walked onto that baseball field in 1986 were gone forever. As they approached Brattleboro, Sarah's phone rang. It was Detective Reeves. "Chun, you're not going to believe this. I've been going through Morrison's apartment more carefully, and I found something hidden in his kitchen. There's a loose floorboard under the refrigerator." "What did you find?" "Adoption papers. For sets, all dated 1995. 3 successful placements, and one is marked placement unsuccessful, subject deceased." Sarah felt the world tilt. Names. That's the thing. The children's names on the adoption papers aren't Castellano. They're listed as Marcus Whitmore Jr., Anthony Whitmore, Daniel Whitmore, and Salvador Whitmore. Torres grabbed the phone. "Detective Reeves, this is Agent Torres. What were the names of the adoptive families?" 3 different families, all in different states. The Hendersons in Colorado took Marcus. The Patels in Arizona got Anthony. The Kowalskis in Michigan adopted Daniel. Salvador's paperwork is marked deceased, dated February 1995. Sarah pulled over at a rest stop, her hands shaking too much to drive safely. The Castellano brothers hadn't just been kidnapped and brainwashed. They'd been given new identities and placed with unsuspecting families who thought they were adopting orphan children. "We need to contact those families," Torres said. "If those boys are still alive, they're living under assumed names with no knowledge of their real identities. And if they remember anything about their real families," Sarah added, "they probably think those memories are just dreams or fantasies." As they sat in the parking lot of the rest stop, surrounded by darkness and the weight of what they'd uncovered, Sarah realized that finding the truth about the Castellano brothers was only the beginning. If Whitmore had done this to them, how many other children had disappeared into his program? How many families had never gotten answers? The lights of Brattleboro appeared ahead of them, and with them, the promise of more secrets waiting to be uncovered. But Sarah was beginning to understand that some truths were more horrifying than the mysteries they replaced. Somewhere out there, if Torres was right, 3 men were living lives built on lies, carrying the faces of the Castellano brothers, but none of their memories. And in a grave somewhere, little Sal, who'd been too young to be successfully reprogrammed, had been buried without his real name. The road to Mountain View Behavioral Health stretched ahead of them, dark and full of answers that Sarah was no longer sure she wanted to find. Mountain View Behavioral Health sat like a wound in the Vermont landscape, its red brick buildings dark against the pre-dawn sky. The facility had been abandoned for over a decade, its windows boarded and its parking lot cracked with weeds, but the bones of Whitmore's operation were still visible in the institutional architecture and the high fence that surrounded the property. Sarah and Agent Torres arrived at 5:30 a.m., just as the FBI's evidence recovery team was setting up their equipment. The morning mist clung to the hills around Brattleboro, giving the entire scene an otherworldly quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. According to Vermont state records, Torres said, consulting her tablet, Mountain View operated from 1979 to 2004 as a residential treatment facility for adolescents with behavioral disorders. Dr. Marcus Whitmore was the director from 1983 until his death in 2003. Sarah stared at the main building, a 3-story brick structure with small, barred windows. He was hiding in plain sight, running illegal experiments under the cover of legitimate treatment. It's more common than you'd think. State oversight of private facilities was minimal in the 80s and 90s. As long as the paperwork looked legitimate and there were no complaints, places like this could operate with very little scrutiny. Special Agent Mike Chun, no relation to Sarah, despite the name, approached them with a set of bolt cutters. "We're ready to breach the main building. The local fire department confirmed the structure is sound, but we should assume there might be hazardous materials inside." They entered through what had once been the main lobby. The air inside was stale and heavy with the smell of mold and decay. Their flashlight beams revealed a reception desk covered in dust, inspirational posters hanging crooked on the walls, and a directory board listing various departments: admissions, group therapy, individual assessment, and ominously, special programs. "Special programs," Torres muttered. "That's where we'll find what we're looking for." The directory indicated that special programs was located in the basement. They found the stairwell behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the institutional smell was replaced by something else, something metallic and wrong. The basement level was different from the rest of the facility. The walls were painted institutional green instead of the cheerful yellow used upstairs, and the lighting fixtures were caged and harsh. A long hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with doors that bore only numbers. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, continuing down the corridor. Sarah pushed open the door to Room 1. Inside was a small concrete cell with a metal bed frame, a toilet, and nothing else. Scratched into the wall above the bed were tally marks, hundreds of them, arranged in groups of 5. Someone had been counting days. Jesus, Torres whispered. This is where he kept them. They moved methodically down the hallway, documenting each room. Room 3 had children's drawings scratched into the walls, stick figures holding hands, a house with a smoking chimney, a baseball diamond with 4 small figures standing together. Room 7 contained what appeared to be restraint equipment built into the walls. Room 12 had a small window, and etched into the glass were 4 names: Marco, Tony, Danny, Sal. They never forgot, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Even after everything Whitmore did to them, they remembered their names. At the end of the hallway was a larger room with a different kind of door, thick steel with multiple locks. The nameplate read Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Director, Special Programs. Inside, they found the administrative heart of the operation. Filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with detailed records of Whitmore's experiments. Patient files, psychological assessments, behavioral modification protocols, and progress reports dating back to 1983. But it was the photographs that made Sarah sick to her stomach. Hundreds of images showing children in various stages of Whitmore's program, documenting their transformation from frightened kids to blank-eyed subjects. Agent Torres found a file marked Project Renaissance, Final Report, 1995. Inside was a comprehensive summary of Whitmore's work, written in the clinical language of academic research, but describing horrors that defied comprehension. Listen to this, Torres said, reading from the report. Subject integration achieved in 73% of cases over 12-year period. Family bond dissolution protocols proved effective in 89% of subjects under age 10. Recommended modifications for future iterations include earlier intervention and enhanced memory suppression techniques. Sarah was examining a wall chart that tracked different subjects through the program. The Castellano brothers were listed as Group C4, with detailed timelines showing their progress through various phases of treatment. But what caught her attention was the final notation. Subjects C4-1, C4-2, and C4-3 successfully placed. Subject C4-4 terminated due to program incompatibility. Terminated, Sarah repeated. They killed Sal because he couldn't be reprogrammed. But Torres had found something else in the filing cabinet that changed everything. Sarah, look at this. It's a shipping manifest from 1995. The manifest was from a company called New Beginnings Placement Services and detailed the transport of 3 subjects to their final destinations. But it wasn't just the Castellano brothers. The list included dozens of other children, all with coded identifications, all shipped to families across the country between 1990 and 1995. This wasn't just about the Castellano boys, Torres said grimly. Whitmore was running a systematic child trafficking operation, disguised as a treatment facility. He was taking missing children, erasing their identities, and selling them to adoptive families who thought they were getting legitimate orphans. Sarah's phone rang, startling both of them in the quiet of the underground room. It was Detective Reeves. Chun, I've been working with the FBI's database team. We ran the adoption records against missing children reports from the same time period. You're not going to believe what we found. Tell me. 47 missing children from across New England between 1983 and 1995. All boys, all between ages 6 and 12, all disappeared under circumstances similar to the Castellano case. And get this, 17 of them were involved in youth sports programs where Frank Morrison was either a coach or volunteer. Sarah felt the room spin around her. 47 children. That's just what we've confirmed so far. The pattern suggests Morrison was operating in multiple states, identifying targets and delivering them to Whitmore's facility. We're talking about one of the largest child trafficking operations in U.S. history. Agent Torres was already on her radio, calling for additional teams. We need forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs. If Whitmore killed the children who couldn't be reprogrammed, their bodies might still be here. As if summoned by her words, one of the evidence recovery team members appeared in the doorway. Agent Torres, you need to see what we found in the sub-basement. They descended another level, following the team member through a maze of storage rooms and utility corridors. The air grew colder and damper, and Sarah could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. We found it behind a false wall, the team member explained, leading them to what appeared to be a small chapel. Wooden pews faced a simple altar, and religious imagery covered the walls. But it was what lay beneath the floorboards that made Sarah's blood run cold. Ground-penetrating radar shows multiple burial sites under the floor, the team member continued. Looks like at least 20 individual graves. Sarah stared at the innocuous-looking wooden floor, knowing that somewhere beneath it lay the remains of children who had been murdered simply because they couldn't forget their families. How long until you can start excavating? We're bringing in specialized equipment. Should be able to begin recovery operations by tomorrow morning. Agent Torres was studying the religious imagery on the walls. Whitmore rationalized what he was doing. Look at these inscriptions. Blessed are those who are reborn. The old self must die for the new to live. He convinced himself he was saving these children by erasing their past lives. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Detective Chun, this is Marcus Henderson. I think I need to talk to you. I've been having dreams about a baseball game. She showed the message to Torres, whose eyes widened. That's one of the adoptive families from the 1995 records. Marcus Henderson, that would be Marco Castellano. Sarah called the number immediately. A man's voice answered, deep and uncertain. Hello, Mr. Henderson? This is Detective Sarah Chun with the Millbrook Police Department. You sent me a text message. Yes, This is going to sound crazy, but I've been seeing news reports about missing children from 1986, and I keep having these vivid dreams. Dreams about brothers, about a baseball game, about being taken away. My adoptive parents always told me I was an orphan, but these dreams feel like memories. Sarah's heart was pounding. Mr. Henderson, I need to ask you some questions. Do you remember the names Marco, Tony, Danny, or Sal? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, in my dreams, someone calls me Marco. And there are 3 other boys. We're always together in the dreams. But that's not possible, is it? I'm an only child. Mr. Henderson, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah explained everything they had discovered. Marcus Henderson, who had been Marco Castellano, listened in stunned silence as she described the kidnapping, the behavioral modification program, and the adoption scheme that had given him a new identity. You're telling me I have brothers? He finally asked, his voice breaking. 2 brothers who are still alive, and one who didn't survive the program. We're working on locating Anthony and Daniel now. I want to see them. I want to remember. Mr. Henderson, Marco, that's going to take time. The psychological trauma of what was done to you and your brothers. Recovery isn't going to be easy or quick. But even as she said it, Sarah could hear something changing in his voice. The careful, measured tone of Marcus Henderson was giving way to something rawer, more emotional. Somewhere deep in his mind, Marco Castellano was waking up. By evening, they had located the other 2 brothers. Anthony Patel, living in Phoenix, was a software engineer who had always felt displaced, like he was missing something important. Daniel Kowalski, a teacher in Grand Rapids, had spent years in therapy trying to understand why he felt incomplete despite having a loving adoptive family. Within 48 hours, all 3 men were on their way to Connecticut. The FBI had arranged for specialized psychological support to help them process the revelation of their true identities and the systematic erasure of their childhood memories. Sarah was at the Millbrook police station when the 3 brothers saw each other for the first time in 29 years. They were middle-aged men now. Marcus was 50, Anthony 48, Daniel 46. But as they stood in the conference room, looking at each other with growing recognition, she could see the children they had once been. I remember you, Marcus said to Anthony, his voice barely a whisper. You had a scar on your chin from falling off your bike. Anthony touched his chin unconsciously. I remember, we shared a room. You used to read me stories before bed. Daniel was staring at both of them, tears streaming down his face. The dreams, he said. They weren't dreams at all. They were memories trying to come back. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful, but Sarah knew it was also incomplete. They had found each other, but Sal would never be part of their family again. "We found him," she told them gently. "Your youngest brother didn't survive the program. We recovered his remains from the facility in Vermont." The grief that followed was raw and devastating. These three men were mourning not just their brother's death, but the loss of their entire childhood, their family, their very identities. They were strangers to each other and to themselves, trying to rebuild connections that had been systematically destroyed decades earlier. But they were also survivors, and they were determined to honor Sal's memory and ensure that what happened to them would never happen to other children. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Millbrook Community Center, watching as the Castellano Brothers Foundation held its first annual fundraiser for missing children. Marcus, Anthony, and Daniel had legally reclaimed their original names and were working together to support families dealing with child abduction cases. The investigation had ultimately uncovered evidence of 63 missing children who had been trafficked through Whitmore's program over a 12-year period. Frank Morrison had been one of several recruiters operating across New England, identifying vulnerable targets and delivering them to the facility. Most of the children who survived the program had been placed with adoptive families under false identities, and the FBI was still working to locate and notify them. Angela Castellano, the boy's mother, had died in 2019, never knowing what happened to her sons. But she had lived long enough to see the case reopened, and she had never stopped believing they would come home. As Sarah watched the three brothers speak to the crowd about their experience and their mission to help other families, she thought about the storage unit that had started it all. Frank Morrison had died believing he had gotten away with his crimes. But in the end, his meticulous record-keeping had been his downfall and the key to solving one of the most complex child trafficking cases in FBI history. The Castellano brothers would never fully recover from what had been done to them. They would spend the rest of their lives rebuilding relationships and recovering memories that had been stolen from them as children. But they had found each other again, and they had chosen to transform their trauma into a force for protecting other children. Outside the community center, a small memorial garden had been planted in honor of Sal Castellano and the other children who hadn't survived Whitmore's program. A simple stone marker bore the inscription, "In memory of the lost children. May their names never be forgotten." Sarah stood before the memorial as the evening light faded, thinking about the long journey from that storage unit to this moment of remembrance and hope. The case was closed, but the work of healing, for the survivors, for their families, and for a community that had carried the weight of mystery for 38 years, was just beginning. The truth had finally emerged from the darkness, and with it, the possibility of justice for children who had been silenced for far too long.